Rain tapped against the kitchen windows like impatient fingers, each drop sharp enough to cut through the silence that had settled over the small room. Chris stood barefoot on the cold tiles, clutching the frayed strap of his school bag as if it were the last thing anchoring him to the life he still hoped to keep. His father loomed near the counter, shoulders squared, jaw tight, the glow from the overhead light carving harsh angles across his face. On the table between them lay the small notebook Chris had hidden for months, its pages open like a confession he never intended to voice aloud. The faint lavender ink, once a private comfort, now felt like a verdict. He wished he could explain the drawings, the careful lines shaped around boys with gentle eyes or bright smiles, but his father's glare left no room for softness. His mother stood beside the sink, fingers gripping the edge as though holding herself in place. She looked at Chris only briefly, and in her glance he saw something trembling, something divided between fear and love. But she said nothing, and that silence felt heavier than the storm growing outside. His father's voice erupted without warning, loud enough to rattle the glasses stacked in the cupboard. He shouted questions that were not questions at all but accusations shaped like demands, leaving no space for answers Chris could actually give. Every word hit the boy with the weight of disappointment sharpened into anger. Chris kept his gaze fixed on the floor, tracing the cracks between the tiles because they were easier to face than the fury narrowing his father's eyes. When his father demanded the truth, Chris finally lifted his head. His voice emerged as barely more than breath, fragile and almost invisible. He admitted what he had been afraid to say aloud, the truth that had grown quietly in the corners of his heart. The room held its breath with him. His father's face twisted, stunned first, then scorched by something far darker than disbelief. Chris saw his mother flinch, her hand rising instinctively before falling again, fingers curling into her palm as though closing around an apology she was too frightened to speak. "Get out," his father said, the words low, steady, terrifying in their finality. He pointed toward the open doorway as if expelling a stranger, not a child who had once curled on his chest during thunderstorms. Chris's throat tightened, but no sound came. His mother's lips parted slightly, then closed again, and that tiny hesitation carved a deeper wound than any shouted condemnation could. Chris waited for something, his name, a plea, a promise, but the only sound was a hollow hum of rain against the roof. His father thrust a small backpack toward him. Inside were only a few items, some clothes, a worn sweater, nothing chosen with care. Chris reached for it slowly, his hand shaking not from the cold but from the realization forming with brutal clarity they truly wanted him gone. He stepped backward toward the doorway, each movement stiff, dreamlike. His mother reached forward a fraction, a soft inhale slipping from her, but she did not cross the threshold between them. She simply whispered, "Please, go before he gets angrier." Chris stepped into the night. The cold hit him first, sharp enough to make his breath catch. Rain slicked his hair to his forehead, trickling down his cheeks in thin, icy lines. He clutched the backpack tightly, more for comfort than protection, and looked back at the doorway where his parents stood in shadow. His mother's outline wavered, her hand rising again as though she might call him back, but the door closed before she could make the choice. The echo of its latch felt like a wall falling into place. He walked down the narrow street, water swirling around his ankles, the world blurred by rain and disbelief. Street lamps flickered above him, casting fractured halos across puddles that rippled beneath his steps. Every house he passed glowed with warm yellow light, reminders of families gathered around meals or stories or soft laughter, everything he had lost in a single hour. He wondered if he should feel anger, but all he felt was a numb ache spreading through his chest. As he reached the end of the block, thunder rolled across the sky, long and low, like some distant warning he could no longer avoid. Lightning flashed, illuminating his small frame and the path stretching ahead, an empty road lined with dark trees swaying restlessly. Chris stopped under a drooping branch, pushing wet hair from his eyes. He tried to steady his breath, but the weight of the night pressed hard, squeezing the last bit of childhood out of him. He whispered to no one, "Why wasn't I enough?" The words were swallowed quickly by the storm, but saying them aloud carved a small space inside him, a hollow opening where pain might one day become strength. He took another step, then another, letting the rain guide him away from the house that no longer felt like a home. His shadow stretched beside him in broken fragments, scattered by each passing flash of light. He kept moving, though every instinct begged him to turn back, to try again, to be someone easier for them to understand. But he knew going back would only mean breaking himself to fit a shape that was never his. He reached the corner where the street split in two directions, each uncertain, each dark. For a moment he stood still, rain rolling down his cheeks like tears he refused to shed. His heart pounded as though urging him to choose anything, anywhere, as long as it was away from the place that had rejected him so completely. He inhaled, shaky but determined, and stepped toward the deeper shadows of the park ahead, unaware that someone, hidden by the rain and distance, was watching the small figure navigate the storm's unforgiving night. And they were stepping closer now. The park lay half-drowned beneath the lingering storm, its benches slick with rain and its pathways littered with fallen leaves that glistened like dark coins under the streetlights. Chris slipped beneath a drooping branch and exhaled a trembling breath, trying to pretend he wasn't shivering. His thin sweater clung heavily to his shoulders, soaked through, each cold thread reminding him how swiftly warmth could vanish from a life. He lowered himself onto the nearest bench, its metal slats unforgiving against his small frame, and hugged his knees to his chest. The world felt impossibly wide now, every rustling leaf, every distant horn, every echo of footsteps deepening his isolation until even the night itself seemed to pull away from him. He lifted his gaze toward the sky, watching clouds drag themselves across the moon like exhausted travelers. The air smelled of earth and wet bark, the kind of smell that usually made him think of childhood games or long walks home after school. Now it simply told him he had nowhere left to go. His stomach rumbled with a low, twisting hunger that felt almost personal, as though his own body were accusing him of failing to keep it safe. He pressed a hand against it and whispered, "Just wait a little," unsure whether he meant optimism or apology. A car passed in the distance, its headlights sliding across the trees. Chris tensed instinctively. He didn't want anyone to see him like this, small, shaking, alone. Shame pulled inside him, not because he believed he had done anything wrong, but because he still wanted his parents to hold him, to tell him he didn't have to brave the storm alone. He pictured his mother standing behind the closed door, her worried eyes hidden in the darkness of their hallway, and wondered whether she was thinking of him now, or whether she had retreated into silence to keep peace with a man who had chosen anger over love. A gust of wind scattered droplets across his face, tugging at his hair like impatient fingers. He pulled the backpack onto his lap and opened it. The few clothes inside were already damp, their faint scent of home clinging to the fabric in a way that made his chest ache. He touched the sweater his mother had folded for him months ago, tracing its seams as though they held the answer to why everything had unraveled so quickly. He wanted to cry, but his tears seemed reluctant to appear, held back by a hardness growing somewhere deep within him. It frightened him, how pain could solidify into something so still. A stray cat trotted across the path, slender and wary. It stopped a few feet away, its yellow eyes reflecting the small pool of light spilling from a nearest lamp. For a moment, it simply stared at him, tail flicking, as if deciding whether he was a threat. Then it padded closer and brushed lightly against the bench leg. Chris lowered a hand, and the cat sniffed his fingers before darting away again into the brush. The small encounter reminded him how desperately he wanted to be acknowledged, if only for a moment, by something warm and breathing. The wind shifted, picking up a faint metallic scent from a nearby trash bin. Chris's stomach clenched again. He debated searching it, horrified at the thought yet more horrified at the hunger-gathering weight inside him. Instead, he closed his eyes and tried to remember the taste of the dinner he never got to eat. Rice still warm from the pot, his mother's gentle touch on his shoulder as she handed him a plate. The memory faded quickly, dissolving into the sound of rain tapping against the bench. As minutes stretched into something heavier, the cold began to burrow into his bones. He tucked his chin against his arms and tried to imagine he was somewhere safer. He pictured the attic nook he used to hide in when arguments filled the house, dusty, cramped, but his, a place where no one shouted, where he could draw sketches without fear of being discovered. The memory offered a small flicker of comfort before fading into the shadows. He whispered to himself, "You're strong enough," though the words sounded fragile. He repeated them anyway, each whisper a thin thread holding him together. The night replied only with a rustling of branches, the quiet murmurs of a world that seemed indifferent to his struggle. Yet within that indifference, he felt a strange sort of clarity forming. If no one came, if no one called him home, he would still push through the night. He had to. The alternative was lying down in the darkness and letting despair swallow him whole. A pair of teenagers passed by the park entrance, laughing loudly as they ran beneath umbrellas. Their joy sliced through the silence, too bright, too distant. Chris watched them until they disappeared, a deep yearning rising in his throat. He didn't envy their laughter. He envied their belonging, how effortlessly they moved through the world, unburdened by secrets that could crack a family in half. As the rain began to lighten, he shifted on the bench, trying to ease a numbness in his legs. He wondered how long he had been outside. Hours? A lifetime? The question barely mattered anymore. What mattered was finding a way through the night. He glanced at a nearby tree, its branches swaying gently. Beneath it, the ground seemed slightly drier. He slid off the bench and settled beneath the tree, curling up against its thick trunk. The bark scratched at his skin, but at least it shielded him from the wind. He closed his eyes again, allowing exhaustion to soften the edges of his face. Just as sleep threatened to pull him under, he heard it, a soft crunch of footsteps on wet gravel, slow and deliberate, approaching from the path he thought was empty. His eyes snapped open. A faint silhouette moved toward him, shaped by the pale glow of the street lamp behind it. The figure paused as if assessing the small, curled shape beneath the tree. Chris's heartbeat quickened. He couldn't tell whether he should run or stay still. The figure took another step, then another, each one measured, unhurried, almost careful. As it drew closer, the outline sharpened into something undeniably human. And then the footsteps stopped, right in front of him. The man stood with an umbrella dripping rainwater onto the gravel, its dark canopy tilted just enough to shield Chris from the worst of the wind. For a moment he didn't speak. He simply studied the shivering boy with a steady, almost searching gaze, as though trying to understand the story behind a child alone in a storm at this late hour. Chris shifted closer to the tree trunk, unsure whether to trust a stranger or brace himself for another blow he wasn't strong enough to take. When the man finally spoke, his voice carried a warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold night. "You look freezing," he said, crouching down so he wouldn't tower over the boy. "Are you hurt?" The question wasn't sharp or suspicious. It was gentle, offered like a blanket he hoped Chris might accept. Chris shook his head slowly, though his trembling betrayed him. He tucked his chin deeper against his chest, wishing he could disappear. The man set the umbrella handle against his knee and reached into his coat, pulling out a folded blanket. He hesitated only long enough for Chris to see his intention, then draped it carefully over the boy's shoulders. The fabric held a faint scent of cedar, warm and clean, wrapping around him like a memory he'd forgotten he needed. Chris inhaled sharply, surprised by how quickly relief could make someone vulnerable. "I'm not going to hurt you," the man added, his tone almost apologetic, as though he understood the weight of promises broken by others. Chris forced himself to look up. The man's face was lined with age, though the lines seemed carved more by compassion than bitterness. His eyes held a quiet sorrow, something that suggested he'd once known nights like this or had witnessed them too closely. Before Chris could speak, his stomach growled loudly, echoing across the wet ground. The man's expression softened even further. "There's a thermos of soup in my car," he said. "Still warm. Would you like some?" The question pierced through Chris's hesitation. Hunger overruled fear, but shame lingered. He nodded once, cautiously, clutching the blanket tighter. The man extended a hand, palm open, leaving space for refusal. Chris didn't take it, but he stood and followed him along the path. The man didn't rush or glance back repeatedly. He walked at a pace that allowed Chris to keep his distance while still staying under the umbrella's shelter. They reached a small car parked beneath a flickering street lamp. The man opened the passenger door and retrieved a silver thermos and a paper cup. Steam drifted upward as he unscrewed the lid, filling the air with a comforting aroma of tomatoes and herbs. He handed the cup to Chris, who wrapped both hands around it, grateful for the heat seeping into his fingers. The first sip nearly made him cry. It wasn't just warm. It tasted like safety, something he'd stopped expecting from the world. "My name's Michael," the man said, leaning against the side of the car instead of standing too close. "I live a few streets from here. I walk the park often when I can't sleep." His voice held no probing curiosity, only the kind of openness that invited trust without demanding it. Chris drank slowly, afraid of finishing too quickly, and considered whether to share his name. The choice felt like a risk. After a long pause, he whispered, "Chris." Michael nodded as though receiving a precious secret. "It's good to meet you," Chris. He didn't ask why the boy was alone at night, didn't demand explanations or details. Instead, he gestured gently toward the car. It's warmer inside. You can sit for a moment if you'd like. No pressure. He placed the umbrella aside so the invitation felt less formal, less like a rescue and more like a temporary shelter offered between two human beings. Chris hesitated, scanning the empty park, the darkened houses beyond, the cold space he'd been forced to inhabit. The wind cut through his sweater again, reminding him he had nowhere else to go. He stepped into the car, settling into the seat cautiously, as though unsure whether he belonged anywhere anymore. Michael closed the door softly and walked around to the driver's side, letting the engine hum to life. Warm air flowed through the vents, brushing Chris's cheeks with gentle insistence. They sat in silence for several minutes, soaking in the heat. Chris watched raindrops race down the window, tracing their paths like fragile stories dissolving before they hit the frame. Michael didn't break the quiet with small talk or forced comfort. Instead, his presence seemed to say that silence, too, could be a kind of kindness. When Chris finally spoke, his voice cracked slightly. I didn't know where else to go. Michael turned toward him, eyes patient. Sometimes, he said softly, the world pushes us out before we're ready to stand. But that doesn't mean we're meant to be alone. He reached for a small box on the dashboard and opened it to reveal a neatly wrapped sandwich. He offered it to Chris, who accepted it with hesitant gratitude. Each bite steadied him, grounding him in the reality that someone, the stranger, was willing to see him as more than an inconvenience. After Chris finished eating, exhaustion washed over him with startling force. His eyelids drooped, and he fought to keep them open, unsure whether sleeping beside someone he'd just met was safe. Michael noticed and lowered his voice. If you're tired, you can rest. I'll stay right here. No surprises. The reassurance felt deliberate, crafted to ease a fear too old for a child his age. Chris let his eyes close for a moment, then longer. The hum of the heater, the whisper of rain, and the steady presence beside him pulled him toward sleep. He drifted in and out, each breath softer than the last. Just before he lost full awareness, he heard Michael speak again, quietly, almost to himself. You remind me so much of him. The word slipped into the dim space between them like a puzzle piece falling into place, though Chris didn't yet understand the picture it belonged to. The morning sun seeped through half-drawn blinds, casting pale stripes across the modest living room where Chris had finally slept in a real bed. For the first time in days, the warmth touched him without stinging, and the soft hum of the heater made him think he could breathe without bracing for the next sharp word or slammed door. He stirred beneath the blankets, eyelids heavy, and saw Michael sitting nearby, leafing through a small stack of papers. The older man's presence was quiet, almost protective, yet something in the way he held the papers made Chris pause, a prickle of curiosity threading through his exhaustion. Michael looked up, noticing the boy's gaze, and offered a small, careful smile. Morning, he said. His voice carried no weight of expectation, just a kind of gentleness Chris had not known he craved. He motioned toward the papers. I need to show you something, but I want you to promise me you'll listen before making any judgments. Chris hesitated, clutching the blanket closer, but nodded. Curiosity outweighed fear, at least for a moment. Michael held out a faded letter, edges worn, handwriting delicate yet uneven. Chris reached for it, his fingers brushing the paper as though it might burn him. He unfolded it slowly. The letter was from Michael's late brother, written years ago to a friend who had been struggling, though the words seemed to echo beyond the page. Michael's voice came softly over the sound of the heater's quiet hum. He wanted to protect someone like you, once, he said, someone who felt out of place, someone rejected simply for being themselves. Chris's eyes traced the letters. The words spoke of fear, of longing, of heartbreak, and of a love that could not fully survive the judgment of others. His throat tightened. He had never seen anything so raw, so painfully honest. For the first time, he glimpsed a sorrow that mirrored his own, yet carried a hint of hope tucked between the lines. He looked up at Michael, who remained calm, almost reverent, as though the past itself had weight enough to bend the room. The revelation struck Chris with a force that left him momentarily speechless. Michael's hand shook slightly as he held the letter. I didn't tell anyone this before, he admitted, voice cracking. because I thought if I spoke, it would make the pain real all over again. But seeing you there in the park, it reminded me of him, and I couldn't let you face that storm alone." Chris's heart thumped unevenly, his mind racing through memories of wet streets, cold benches, and nights where fear had been his only companion. Chris tried to speak, but his voice felt lodged somewhere between his throat and chest. He only managed to whisper, Why didn't anyone help him?" The question hung in the space between them, fragile and full of longing. Michael lowered a letter and sat back slightly, running a hand over his face. "Because sometimes even love is not enough to break patterns of fear," he said. "People are trapped by their own mistakes, by their own pasts. They want to protect, but they end up pushing away." The room seemed to hold its breath with him. Chris's mind swirled. His father's anger, his mother's silence, the cold street, the rain that had stung his skin hours ago. He realized now that his parents' cruelty was not just about him. It was a continuation of a cycle, one rooted in fear and misunderstanding, one Michael's brother had faced too. The truth hit with clarity. He was not alone in his suffering, though the world had tried to convince him otherwise. Chris's hands trembled as he returned the letter to Michael, eyes wide. "So, it wasn't just me?" he asked. The question was quiet, but heavy with relief. Michael shook his head, lips tight, eyes glistening. "No, and that's why your story matters. It's bigger than one family. It's about breaking patterns, about showing that the next person doesn't have to face the same wolves alone." A long silence fell, broken only by the faint hiss of the heater and the distant hum of traffic. Chris traced the edge of the blanket around his shoulders, thinking about the cold streets and benches he had endured. The memory still hurt, but now it carried context, a thread connecting pain to purpose. He felt something shift inside him, a fragile understanding that his life could become a story of more than just rejection, a story that might protect someone else someday. Michael watched him, eyes steady, and finally said, "I want to help you, Chris. Not just tonight, not just for warmth. I want to help you build a life where the world's cruelty doesn't define you." His words were neither commanding nor pleading. They were a gentle offer, extended with care and patience. Chris nodded slowly, letting the idea sink in. For the first time, safety felt tangible, something he could almost touch rather than merely wish for. The day stretched onward, sunlight warming the edges of the room, revealing dust motes dancing in the gentle glow. Chris moved slowly, feeling the weight of sleepless nights lessen slightly. But the revelation of Michael's brother, the letter, the story of past sorrow, these things lingered, heavy and sacred, reminding him that even kindness often arrived after pain. He understood now that his journey was not just about finding shelter or warmth. It was about recognizing patterns, about choosing courage over fear, even when the path was unclear. Later, Chris stepped to the window and looked outside. The park was now quiet, leaves still wet from the receding rain, and a soft wind stirred the branches. For a moment, he imagined himself there again, alone and afraid. But this time, he didn't feel the same helplessness. He felt tethered to something larger, Michael's quiet guidance, the memory of a brother lost too soon, and the fragile thread of hope connecting him to a future not yet written. As the day drew on, Michael busied himself with breakfast, leaving Chris to absorb the room's warmth and the letter's weight. The revelation of a hidden truth, once secret and painful, had shifted the world beneath his feet. He could see now that the cruelty he had endured was not merely personal. It was a reflection of fear left unexamined, patterns repeated across generations. His anger still lingered, but now it was tempered by understanding. And in that tempered space, he found the faintest ember of resolve. Chris turned the letter over in his hands one last time, careful not to crease it. He tucked it into the folds of the blanket around him, a tangible reminder of both sorrow and the possibility of healing. He thought of the park, of the wet bench, and of the moments when the world had seemed impossibly harsh. And he realized, quietly, that he was ready to face the world differently. Not with fear, not with shame, but with awareness, and with the fragile courage that came from understanding the stories behind the pain. Then, as he rose from the chair and stretched, he noticed something he had not seen before, a photograph tucked beneath the stack of papers Michael had been reading. It showed a young boy, smiling faintly, standing beside a man whose eyes held a sadness almost identical to Michael's. Chris's breath caught. The resemblance was uncanny, yet somehow more than that. It was a bridge, a connection between past and present, between loss and the possibility of protection. Chris stared at the photograph, the room silent except for the distant hum of the heater. A chill ran through him, but it was not fear. It was a first awareness that the journey he thought was his alone was in fact intertwined with stories he had yet to fully understand. And at that moment, he knew the next steps would not be easy. Yet they were necessary. He swallowed hard, glancing at Michael, whose expression suggested he already understood the way to the connection Chris had just discovered. The boy in the photograph, the man beside him, the letter, threads weaving into something larger than Chris had imagined. A quiet tension settled in the room, filled with questions, possibilities, and the unspoken truth that what they had uncovered would demand action. Chris's eyes lingered on the photograph, and a whisper escaped him, barely audible. This changes everything. Chris stood outside the small town hall, hands gripping the straps of his backpack like fragile lifelines. The autumn wind tugged at his hair and chilled the skin beneath his thin sweater, but he refused to let it push him back. Around him, the crowd murmured, a mixture of curious neighbors, concerned parents, and strangers drawn by the whispers that had grown louder over the past weeks. Banners flapped in the wind, their colors dull beneath the gray sky, slogans half visible, some accusing, some supportive. Chris's stomach twisted with fear and anticipation, but beneath it lay a flicker of something heavier, resolve. Michael walked beside him, quiet and steady, a shadow of reassurance. He did not speak much, only offering a hand on Chris's shoulder now and then, a reminder that he was not alone. Chris felt the warmth of it even through the fabric of his sweater. He drew in a long, shivering breath, tasting the cold air and determination alike. Today would not be like the night he had wandered the streets, soaked and shivering, invisible to the world. Today he would be seen. Inside, the room was dim, lit by fluorescent strips that flickered lazily, failing to hide the tension that wrapped around the people gathered. Parents and neighbors lined the walls, some whispering, others watching silently. Chris scanned the crowd, seeking faces familiar from his life before, though he knew many had turned their backs long ago. He spotted a few, their expressions hesitant, guilty, or curious, and his throat tightened. He could not allow fear to dominate now. He had survived worse alone, and he had learned from Michael that strength did not always roar. It could stand quietly, immovable. The meeting began with formalities, voices echoing off the high ceiling. Chris shifted his weight from foot to foot, feeling the unfamiliar sensation of eyes tracking him, assessing him, questioning him. Each gaze was a reminder of the world's judgment, but also an opportunity. This was not a stage for dramatics. This was a stage for truth. He waited for the right moment, listening as complaints and old grievances were voiced. He realized the room did not know the full story, and that ignorance had fueled fear and cruelty for years. When a lull arrived, Chris stepped forward. His legs felt heavy, but he straightened his shoulders, recalling Michael's gentle advice. Speak with honesty, not anger. I'm Chris, he began, voice shaking at first, and I am here because I want you to understand what it feels like to be pushed away for being yourself. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink. The room shifted slightly, some eyes widening, others narrowing, all of them now tuned to the small, trembling figure speaking truth. He spoke of the night his family had rejected him, the rain-soaked streets, the cold park bench, and the fear that had seeped into every corner of his body. He spoke of hunger, loneliness, and the silent prayers he had whispered in the dark, hoping for someone, anyone, to see him. His voice gained strength as he continued, finding rhythm in the truth. He did not accuse with venom. He presented what had happened with precision, letting the stark reality speak louder than any anger could. Some in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, murmurs rising and falling like a restless tide. His father sat among them, arms crossed, face rigid, but his mother's eyes glistened, unable to look away. Chris's gaze caught hers briefly. No words passed between them, but in that fleeting glance she conveyed the conflict of a heart torn between fear and love. Chris drew a shuddering breath and returned his attention to the room. This was no longer only about his pain. It was about illuminating a truth that had been ignored for too long. A few voices tried to interrupt, but Chris lifted a hand, quieting the room with a gesture that seemed impossibly small yet impossibly commanding. I am not here to fight you, he said, voice steadier now. I am here to show you what it means to be human. To feel love and fear, hope and rejection. To make choices that either break cycles of pain or continue them. His words rippled across the room, and for a moment, even the skeptics fell silent. Michael stepped forward subtly, standing behind Chris but close enough to offer unwavering support. His presence alone seemed to anchor the room, a silent testament that kindness could accompany courage. Chris's confidence grew in response, each word building upon the last. He spoke of patterns, familial, societal, generational, that often disguise cruelty as tradition, and he offered the fragile hope that they could choose differently, that no child should be made to feel invisible or worthless. His father's jaw tightened, and he rose abruptly, the room holding its collective breath. Chris's pulse quickened, fear flickering at the edge of his consciousness, but he did not falter. He had faced a storm alone before. Now, he had chosen to meet it openly. His father opened his mouth, and for a heartbeat, it seemed an explosion of blame might follow. But then he stopped, eyes darting to the faces around him, realizing the boy he had rejected was speaking with undeniable truth and quiet authority. A whisper rose among the audience, then another, until murmurs swelled into hesitant applause. Some of the town's residents began to nod slowly, recognition and understanding dawning. Chris felt his heart lift slightly. The wind outside rattled the old windows, carrying a sound that felt almost celebratory. Not everyone had understood, and some never would, but the seeds of change had been planted. Chris's mother moved closer to the front, her expression trembling with uncertainty and hope. She did not speak, but she placed a trembling hand on her chest, acknowledging the pain she had once been too afraid to confront. Chris's eyes met his again, and for a brief, luminous moment, he felt the weight of isolation lift slightly. The journey had not erased the past, but it had opened the door to reconciliation, or at least understanding. The meeting began to draw to a close, yet the energy in the room lingered. Chris felt exhausted, yet alive in a way he had not imagined possible. The confrontation had been far from easy, but it had allowed him to reclaim a part of himself that had been lost. He had stood, trembling but unwavering, in front of a room that had once ignored him, and in doing so, he had asserted not just his own worth, but the value of every child silenced by fear. As he stepped back from the podium, he caught sight of a small group lingering near the exit. Some nodded in respect, some offered tentative smiles. Chris knew their understanding was only beginning, and that skepticism would linger, but a shift had occurred, visible, tangible, undeniable. He had faced the people who had wronged him, not with fury, but with courage anchored in honesty. Outside, the wind carried the first hints of twilight, and the town hall doors swung open. Chris and Michael stepped into the fresh air. Leaves swirled in the dim light, and the distant sound of a dog barking punctuated the evening calm. Chris exhaled, the tension of the room dissolving into the night. But as he looked back at the building, at the faces still watching from windows and doorways, he knew the journey was far from complete. There were more berries, more hearts to touch, more cycles to challenge. Chris's hand brushed against Michael's. "Thank you," he whispered, voice low but steady. Michael's hand tightened around his briefly, a silent acknowledgement that the battle had been shared, even if the victory was only partial. The wind lifted, tugging at their coats, carrying with it the scent of rain from earlier storms, and Chris realized that the courage he had discovered today would be needed again and again in ways he could not yet foresee. And then, as they began to walk toward the quiet streets, Chris caught a glimpse of a familiar figure in the shadows near the edge of the crowd, a presence that unsettled him, a hint that not all had been revealed, not all wounds addressed. He froze for a heartbeat, sensing that the confrontation they had just endured was only one step in a larger journey, one that would test both courage and the fragile trust he had begun to place in the world. The first light of dawn filtered through the misty streets, casting a pale, trembling glow over the quiet town. Chris walked alongside Michael, their footsteps echoing softly against the damp pavement. The confrontation of the town hall still hummed inside him, an energy both heavy and exhilarating. He had faced voices that once silenced him, and discovered a strength he hadn't known existed. Yet he felt the weight of unfinished business, a quiet reminder that healing was rarely immediate and never simple. As they approached the small park where his nightmare had begun, Chris slowed. The bench that had once held him like a cold, unforgiving cradle now appeared ordinary in the soft morning light. Leaves, wet and glistening, clung to the metal slats, and a stray gust sent a swirl of yellowed edges dancing across the ground. He bent, brushing his fingers over the damp surface, feeling the memory of nights spent curled there, shivering against the rain. Pain and fear returned in fragments, but beneath them a fragile thread of courage persisted. Michael watched quietly, giving him space. "It's strange," he said, voice low, "how the places that hurt us most can also be the places where we find what we're made of." Chris didn't respond immediately. He only allowed himself a long, steadying breath, the scent of wet earth grounding him. He could almost hear the echoes of the rain, of the loneliness, of the small prayers whispered into darkness. Each one had led him here, to this fragile, hard-earned moment. A figure emerged from the shadows near the edge of the park. Chris tensed, recognizing the shape as his father, hesitating at the boundary where light and shadow collided. For a heartbeat, old fear surged, sharp and bitter, threatening to undo the courage he had summoned in the hole. His father's posture was stiff, yet there was something in the set of his shoulders, something fractured and tentative, that betrayed uncertainty. Chris's heart thudded unevenly, anger, relief, and longing mixed into a sensation that made him ache and tremble at once. His father's voice broke the morning stillness, rough and hesitant. "Chris." The single word carried a weight that pressed against the air, trembling with guilt and uncertainty. Chris felt a surge of emotion he hadn't anticipated. The old longing for acknowledgement, for the chance to be seen, returned in full force. He straightened, shivering not from cold but from the intensity of the moment. "Yes?" he asked, voice steady though quiet. The man's eyes darted, catching Michael's watchful gaze before returning to Chris. I was wrong," he admitted, voice faltering, barely more than a whisper. "I let fear guide me. I didn't see you. His words caught, stuttering under the weight of shame. Chris's stomach tightened. He had imagined this moment countless times, but never had he thought it would arrive so raw, so unpolished. The anger he had carried for months rose, but it was tempered now by something heavier. Possibility, the chance for something new. Chris's mother appeared next, stepping lightly onto the path, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for him. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, lips parted, ready to speak yet cautious. Chris's gaze softened despite himself. He could feel the tension that had fractured their family, the fear that had silenced love, and he allowed himself a cautious hope. "I've been waiting for you," he whispered, voice low, carrying the quiet power of patience earned through pain. The three of them stood together for a long moment, the park holding its breath. Leaves whispered in the wind. Distant bird broke into hesitant song, and the faint light of dawn seemed to gather around them. Chris's father took a slow step forward, then another, reaching for the boy he had once rejected. Chris did not flinch. Instead, he let the space between them shrink until their hands met, tentative, careful, and trembling with unspoken apology. Michael stepped back, allowing the reunion to unfold. His eyes softened as he watched Chris and his parents navigate the delicate terrain of reconciliation. No words were perfect. No apology could erase months of fear and pain. But the act of reaching, of acknowledging mistakes, created a bridge over the years of silence and cruelty. Chris felt the tension inside and begin to dissolve, replaced by a tentative warmth he had thought impossible in the shadow of betrayal. The morning deepened, and Chris spoke finally, his voice firm yet tender. "It's not enough to just say sorry, but it is enough to start. And I am willing to let us start." His father nodded slowly, face softened by emotion, and his mother let out a shaky breath, relief spilling quietly through her. The small victories of honesty, of courage, of truth spoken without fear, felt monumental. Chris realized that the storm he had weathered was not over, but the rain no longer had power to drown him. Michael smiled, a quiet pride in his gaze, and Chris felt the anchor of his presence beside him. "This," Michael said softly, "is what it means to survive. Not just to endure, but to transform what tried to break you into something stronger." Chris nodded, feeling the words settle into the marrow of his bones. He looked at the trees, the path, the bench where he had first curled in despair, and realized the space around him was no longer hostile. It was a canvas, a place where courage, honesty, and love could grow. The family lingered in the park, each step forward fragile yet deliberate. Chris's father spoke softly, words careful but genuine, beginning the work of rebuilding trust. His mother's laughter, tentative at first, rippled across the space, carrying warmth like sunlight. Chris absorbed each gesture, each apology, each small act of presence, understanding that redemption was not a single moment but a series of choices, a weaving of lives back together with care and intention. As the sun rose higher, painting the leaves gold, Chris allowed himself a deep exhale. The tension of months, of nights spent shivering on cold benches, of fear and isolation, seemed to loosen. He felt strength not just in himself, but in the acknowledgement of those who had hurt him and now sought to repair. Forgiveness, he realized, was less about erasing pain and more about choosing courage over resentment. Michael cleared his throat softly. "There's one more thing," he said, producing a small, neatly folded envelope. Chris took it, curiosity pulling at him. Inside were letters from others, people who had faced similar rejection, similar fear. Their words spoke of resilience, of hope, of lives reclaimed. Chris felt the weight of countless unseen battles fold into his hands, a testament that his story was now part of something larger, a chain of courage linking past and future. He looked back at the bench where he had once felt invisible, then at the dawn-streaked sky. He understood now that the journey was far from over, yet he carried with him the knowledge that storms could be faced, that patterns could be broken, and that even the smallest acts of love could illuminate the darkest nights. He raised his eyes to the light, a quiet determination settling in his chest. Chris turned to Michael, who nodded, a silent affirmation that the boy's courage had shifted more than just hearts. It had begun to reshape the world around him. And as they walked together, leaving the park behind, Chris knew the future awaited with its own challenges, but also with promise. He had endured the night, faced the storm, and stood in the dawn of something new. Outside the park, shadows flickered against the buildings, hinting that not all paths were clear, that the world still carried unknown tests. But Chris's footsteps were firm, guided by the fragile, luminous strength of experience, and by the knowledge that courage, once claimed, could never be taken away. He exhaled deeply, letting the air fill his lungs with both the chill of reality and the warmth of hope. And as the morning light spread across the streets, he realized the night had ended, but the story, his story, was only beginning. Courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about standing even when you are. If this story touched you, tell me where you're watching from. Because somewhere out there, someone's still fighting their storm. And your kindness might be the light they need.